I don't need to tell people what time it is. A couple things just to start. I want to, I think committee members already know this. Make sure the interested people in the audience do. The schedule for this committee, we have only two more, this subcommittee, excuse me, we have only two more meetings after this. Given how today has gone, I may this may change. I'll see if I can find some other days, but plan on our next subcommittee meeting being next Thursday, a week from today, again after sub 2, and then Tuesday, February 4th. Also, I guess on that day it'll be after sub 1. That is planned. So we have two more after this. There are a bunch of bills that'll go by today. We all know what happens. Things line up, things jam up at the end, so there will be a lot less going by for the day next week. That's just a word to the wise. First thing we're going to do is cut down on this docket pretty significantly. There are a number of bills going by for the day. They are HB 234, Delegate Mugler, HB 528, Delegate Subramaniam, HB 1225, Delegate Tran, HB 1607, Delegate Lindsay, HB 1664, Delegate Hayes, HB 1677, Delegate Keem. We also, at the request of Delegate Ware, the patron of HB 206, has asked that bill be stricken from the docket. That requires a recorded vote.
So moved.
HB 206. The clerk will open the roll. Clerk will close the roll. Motion carries 9-0. For those who weren't here earlier, HB 1067 has already been referred to general laws, so it is off today's docket as well, tonight's docket as well. So I haven't done the math, but that cuts down this evening's docket fairly substantially. I promised Delegate Campbell he would go first this evening, so Delegate Campbell, HB 205.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. House Bill 205 is a bill to amend in sections 10.1-11975 and 10.1-11976 of the Code of Virginia. And basically, I'm going to start off by saying in my district, in the town and surrounding area of Lexington, because of Washington and Lee and VMI, I have a surplus of engineers, and we have a wind project that the governor referred to the other night in the State of the Commonwealth called Rocky Forge Wind Project. These gentlemen all got together after the completion of that project and basically did an evaluation on it, and they brought those requests to me and asked me if I would introduce legislation that would actually make a few technical changes and make future projects better. The first thing I need to do is to offer a technical amendment. Line 50, the number 150 should have been stricken, and it should have been 100 inserted there. The Rocky Forge Wind Project, the Virginia legislature...
Hold on, Delegate. I heard a motion. Is there a second?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All in favor? Aye. All right, the amendments before us.
Thank you. The Virginia legislature passed permit by rule statute in 2009. The statute evolved from a very lengthy and disjointed SEC review process for a wind project in Highland County. The purpose of the statute was to streamline the application process. The Rocky Forge Wind Project in Botetourt County has uncovered other problems with small wind projects. DEQ is on record stating that a complete application is the permit. DEQ does not approve or disapprove the application submitted under permit by rule. If the application is complete, then the company has their permit. Correcting a few issues is the reason for these changes that I'm bringing before you today. Permit by rule uses the power industry definition of a small project, which is 100 megawatts. And from this, we change all of the language in the code section to 100 megawatts. The wind projects classified small should disturb fewer than 50 acres in completed construction. Under 10.1-1197-6B2, some renewable energy companies use a strategy of locating projects near county lines so that the project boundary line, so a project boundary line less than 2 miles from the jurisdictional boundary is not qualified for permit by rule. Under 10.1-1197.6B5, wind energy projects, the engineering certification shall also state the amount of energy projected to be generated by the facility on an annual average basis based on the wind studies conducted at the proposed site for a minimum of 2 years. Under 10.1-1197-6B13, requires DEQ to conduct public meetings and not the builder of the project. These individuals that brought this to me felt that these were minor technical changes, and as I stated when I started out, that they felt that these would improve and help the future projects that we have in the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Delegate Campbell. Any questions from the committee for Delegate Campbell? Delegate Ayala? Oh, no questions. Actually, I have one. Delegate Campbell, I read this. It gave me some pause that in some sense it allows one jurisdiction to, if not control, at least exercise a lot of influence on what a neighboring jurisdiction is doing. Is that right?
They felt like that the wind projects being put within the 2-mile area between two jurisdictions is something that DEQ should actually handle and do the public hearings, because in the Rocky Forge project, the contractor held one public hearing down in Botetourt County at the town of Fincastle, and citizens in Rockbridge were pretty much cut off from the whole process. So that is where they're coming from with that.
Any other questions for Delegate Campbell? Anyone in the audience want to speak in favor of the bill? Anyone want to speak in opposition to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Matt Moran on behalf of MDVC of the Solar Energy Industries Association. We oppose the bill. Unfortunately, Delegate Campbell, I think this bill would affect a number of utility-scale solar projects that fall between 100 and 150 megawatts that are currently permitted through a permit by rule process that would no longer be able to be approved through that process. We oppose the bill.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, David Paler with DEQ. The administration strongly opposes the bill as it would be a detriment to the ability to meet the energy goals of the administration.
Anyone else in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, member of the committee, respectfully, Delegate, we do oppose the legislation because we feel the restrictions are arbitrary on wind permitting projects. Thank you.
Delegate, you get the last word.
I think that the bill applies to wind projects and would not affect solar projects. So that's pretty much what I have to say. I felt like that the changes that my citizens asked for were reasonable. Basically, DEQ being involved in the process, I don't think it's unreasonable as far as doing the actual public interviews or holding the public hearings if the project is within 2 miles of a county line.
Mr. Chairman,
Delegate Lopez?
I have a motion. Motion to lay on the table.
There's a motion to lay on the table. A second. That's a recorded vote. Clerk will please open the roll. Clerk will close the roll. Motion passes. The bill is laid on the table by a vote of 9-0. Thank you, Delegate.
Thank you.
Delegate Carol Foy. You have HB 432.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My bill, House Bill 432, what it does is right now, work is being contracted by public utilities through a competitive bidding, meaning the person with the lowest cost automatically qualifies as the business awarded the contract. What my bill seeks to address is the issue we have with small women and minority-owned businesses. So what my bill does is two things. First, it allows that the result of contracting with, if it is a small women or minority-owned business, they can be awarded the contract as long as their cost does not exceed more than 5% of the lowest cost qualified business. So this bill actually came from a Chamber of Commerce roundtable that I had a couple months ago, when the question was posed, how do we get more contracts awarded to women and minority-owned businesses? And so given the fact that a lot of these businesses do not have access to capital or the funds to be able to sometimes compete with larger businesses, this is something that we can do in order to help them gain greater access. So House Bill 432 addresses equity by promoting small women-owned or minority-owned businesses and industries related to public utilities, and it fosters greater accessibility to state-funded projects, leverages the skills and talents of smaller growing businesses. And I will answer any questions that the committee has.
Any questions for the patron from the committee? Delegate Lopez?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could the patron describe or does she have information about the number of minority and women-owned businesses and small businesses that are starting to play in this arena?
I do not have that exact number with me right now. I could get that to the
I'd appreciate that. That'd be great.
Any other questions for the patron?
Mr. Chair,
Delegate Keane?
I do have a question, but I'd like to listen to this. I see some people standing up. I'd like to hear from the public first, and I'd like to ask a couple of questions after that.
Before we take public comment, any other questions from the committee? Anyone here to speak in favor of the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. With gratitude to the patron, Catherine Bond with Dominion Energy, and we support her bill.
Good evening, committee. Carla Loeb with Segura Solar. We support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone here to speak against the bill? Any further questions for the patron from the panel?
Yes, sorry, I should have done RTS. Mr. Chair, yeah. Thank you, and I commend the delegate for the creativity in this, and I think I attended one of your Chamber of Commerce roundtables in Prince William County where we had these kinds of conversations. I'm glad that you're able to follow up with this. My seatmate here and I are big supporters of minority-owned, small-owned businesses having being alumni of the U.S. Small Business Administration, where we spent some time working on these issues. So I commend you. I think this is a really good, innovative idea. My only question is, I just want to understand this so that as we see these types of bills in the future, or if there are going to be similar bills like this in the future, the usual way that government, whether it's federal, state, or local levels, the usual way that we try to encourage government, public sector contracting and spending for allocated, designated organizations like small or medium and or women, veterans, et cetera. When we do that, it's generally done as a straightforward set aside or a number for the contract itself. What you're doing is using the back end as the incentive for the corporations who then have to appear before the SEC to be able to prove that they did in fact do the right thing and therefore not to be able to use that money that would normally be put in the rate as to be offset. So that's, in a way, it may be an interesting incentive that we hadn't thought about before, and it's also, I believe, breaking new ground. I'm just wondering, is there another model like that we know of anywhere in Virginia that we've done this? Because if this is one way that we do this, I like it, and I'd like to see if we can try this in other contexts, but I just can't think of another place where you have an incentive where a business goes in front of an agency and saying, look back at what we've done and give us some credit for what we did that we believe are laudable policy goals, as opposed to applying ahead of time saying, here's a percentage, we're going to meet the percentage. I just want to understand this going forward.
Absolutely. So this was a really creative solution that was proposed at the roundtable. And to my understanding, it's a part of the bidding process. So if a SWAM member submits as a subcontractor submits a bid to the contractor and the contractor puts in, even if that bid may be 5%, up to 5% more than the lowest bid contractor, that SWAM business still can't be, or that bid still can't be deemed unreasonable and cannot not be awarded just because it isn't the lowest qualified bid. So it makes it a little bit more competitive for SWAM bidders, and I think overall that's what we want to do, because I think we know that a lot of times women and minority-owned businesses don't have necessarily access to capital or the resources that other more established and larger businesses may have. So it's to make them a lot more competitive and attractive, and hopefully help them have more access to these type of contracts.
Mr. Chair, I want to thank the patron, and I think this really is an innovative way of doing this, and I encourage us to give this a try, and seeing that some of our friends in the audience are willing to try this, I commend you for this idea. I hope that we can try this out for some time.
Delegate Kilgore?
Could I ask Mr. Chairman, can I ask the State Corporation Commission a question?
Of course.
If somebody's here from the State Corporation Commission. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kim Pate. I'm with the State Corporation Commission.
If I could ask you a question, do we have anything like this now? Are we doing any program like this now at the State Corporation Commission?
Where there's a bid that's put in, and then there's like a 5% adder that is deemed to be prudent or reasonable. No, I cannot think of one at this point in time.
Okay, so basically, if you understand, I mean, by reading this, so what this would allow is if up to 5% more cost if it's a SWAM, if it's a small women or minority business. Is that correct?
That's how I understand it, yes.
So who would pay that 5%?
The customers of the utility would pay that.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Ayala? No, okay. Delegate Ware?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, thank the patron for bringing it forward. And oftentimes we have to choose between competing goods. Since I've served on this committee, certainly in recent years, one of the things that I've tried my best to do is protect the ratepayers. And it seems to me we've got the competing good of finding more opportunity for SWAM businesses, and we've got the good of maintaining the rates at the lowest reasonable rate we can for ratepayers. For me, at this point, that second goal, which is one I've tried to consistently seek, is the one that predominates. But again, I appreciate you bringing the legislation.
Of course. Thank you.
Delegate, you get the last word.
Yes, I think the subcommittee for consideration of this. I think it is an innovative and creative solution. It is up to 5%, so it doesn't necessarily mandate or say it will be 5%. It could be 1%. But at the end of the day, I think that there's some way that we need to make some substantial traction in this area. And I think this is something that we can do to make these SWAM businesses a lot more competitive, especially in this environment that we have now. The numbers have been stagnant, and I think this is a great solution that can solve this problem. So thank you for your consideration.
Committee operates by motion. Delegate Marshall.
Yes. Would you consider online, I guess it's, let me see, on line 21, removing the 5%?
To remove the 5%, and Mr. Chairman, is there a recommendation for another amount, like 3%?
No, I was thinking like 0%.
Delegate Marshall, could you direct this again to where you're talking about?
Well, in the bill, she's mentioned 5% several times, and so on line 21, it says do not exceed by more than 5% the cost, therefore. So my question is that, listening to what Delegate Ware said, and I somewhat agree with Delegate Ware, is that I think your idea is good, but could the idea stand on its own without the 5%?
Delegate Kilgore?
The problem is if you take that up to 5%, by more than 5%, it's wide open. Could it be 30%? I mean, it could be anything, right? I don't know if you read that.
I think that's a friendly amendment. I will take that amendment. I will accept that amendment. I like that amendment.
I don't know if I do that. Whoa. She's quick. Yeah, she is. I wouldn't do that.
Delegate Carol Ford, I don't get the impression that you're regarding Delegate Marshall's suggestion as a friendly amendment.
I believe that, Mr. Chairman, what Delegate Kilgore is referring to, if we remove the 5% altogether, it does leave it open. If that is the intention of the amendment of the delegate who proposed the amendment, Delegate Marshall, then if we want to leave it open, we can leave it open. I do think there should be some type of number there. If the subcommittee is not okay with 5%, I'm okay with 3%. But the essence of the bill is to say that given the limited resources sometimes and access to capital, we understand the predicament of small businesses and we want to work with them and say, hey, we're willing to help you and try to offset some of that by making you more competitive with others, by saying, your bid may not be the lowest, but we're willing to give you an adder up to a certain amount. If you take that out, I think you take away the essence of and the spirit of the entire bill.
We operate by motion. Delegate Ayala? Hold on. I recognize Delegate Ayala.
May I ask the delegate, I have a question. In my mind, I look at this like, I just started a business about a year and a half ago. It's in its cultivating stage in federal contracting. And in federal contracting, and I'm trying to put the analogy with the concept here, they flag businesses like veteran-owned businesses with these sorts of the preference that you're indicating here. Am I reading that correctly? Am I understand that this preference considerations have the same type of mechanism afforded to them as well?
Mr. Chairman, to the delegate's statement, yes, it's true. There are many preferences, especially on the federal level. You have veterans' preferences. You have all different types of federal employee preferences. You have preferences, and they're built there, and they're built there for a reason, understanding that there are certain type of classes that you want to help out or even protect in a certain manner. And I think here in Virginia, we have a real appetite for helping small women and minority-owned businesses, and this is one of the ways that we can actually do that. It's not mandating that there will be more costs passed to the ratepayers that they have to pay, but it's just giving an ability for there to be an adder for a difference of up to 5% between the lowest bidder, because the lowest bidder doesn't always mean the best materials, the best quality, the best product. But what we do want to do is incentivize more small women and minority-owned businesses to have access to some of these contracts and to these projects.
Delegate Kilgore?
I have a amendment on line, see, I'm trying to figure, on line 21, where it's by more than, strike 5 and insert 3.
Motion is to strike the word 5 and insert the word 3 on line 21 after the word than. Motion's been made and seconded.
And Mr. Chairman, the reason let's just try it out and see if this works. I think, 5% on a, some of these power plants are huge and a lot of money. And 5% could be a big number. So I'm just throwing this out to see if 3% and see if it works and see if it brings more women and minority businesses into this type work.
Anyone else want to speak to the amendment? There's been a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Amendment is passed.
Now I move to report as amended.
Been a motion to report and a second. Clerk will open the roll. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports with an amendment 8-1. Thank you, Delegate Carroll-Foy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the subcommittee.
Delegate Bourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I believe I have House Bill 859, which would require or ask the Department of Emergency Management to establish a 2-year resiliency hub pilot program, which is basically just to develop a program by which we would have solar panels and batteries in a publicly accessible facility for vulnerable communities when severe weather events or other grid disruptions cause an electrical outage. In the spirit of full disclosure, there's not a budget amendment associated with this. And so, Mr. Chairman, it would be my hope, my request, if it's the will of the committee, that we might ask the chair of the full committee to send a letter to the Environmental Justice Council to study how we might develop this program and implement it, and then come back next year in 2021 and fully implement a pilot program for this type of policy.
I can't speak for the chair, but something tells me she'll be amenable.
And there were a couple of amendments that talked about how we define a vulnerable community and whether or not that's an environmental justice community. I think Delegate Keem has a piece of legislation moving its way through that would further define and tighten up where these communities are. And so I do have a couple folks here that can speak to any sort of detailed questions that you might have about it. But I think the prudent thing to do would be to have the Environmental Justice Council study this and come back with a recommendation to the committee.
Thank you, Delegate. We're happy to hear from your witnesses. The hour is
I know
late.
that they're going to be brief. I think there's just one. Corinna?
Did they travel from great distances?
Yeah.
Exactly. North side of Richmond.
The other side of Richmond.
The other side of Richmond, yeah. That doesn't count. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, it's just you support.
We thought you were going to say
We
something
are very
supportive.
supportive of the initiative. We would like to see a recommendation from the Environmental Justice Council and an amendment to reflect that this initiative is intended to benefit environmental justice communities or fence line communities is consistent with our intent there. We also had another amendment to perhaps narrow the scope of the proposal to be reflected in its name as a resilience power generator rather than a resilience hub.
Sorry to interrupt. So just so I understand the delegate's intention, you want to carry this over till next year?
Yes.
Correct.
We'll ask Chairman Ward to write a letter.
Correct.
Which can incorporate those suggestions that we were just hearing about.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman,
Delegate Keem.
I have a motion. Mr. Chairman, I move that we recommend carrying this legislation over under Rule 22 to 2021 with your personal request to our full chairwoman that this bill be referred to the Environmental Justice Council with the understanding of the expansion that you'd like to see.
Motion's been made and seconded. This is a voice vote. All in favor? Opposed? Motion passes. We'll
I
make that
thank the
happen,
chairman
Delegate
and the
Bourne.
subcommittee for their time.
Delegate Reed.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I have an amendment in the form of the substitute, and do you have this, or? There's not a lot of significant changes, but it was more than just a few lines, so I thought it would be more appropriate to just do it as a complete substitute.
Delegate Reed, could you describe what your substitute does while we're passing it out?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. In the first section, as far as the definitions are concerned, it changes some of the definitions from being 6 inches to at least 12 inches. It kind of makes it more restrictive so that it's not whichever is greater. And then in the second part of the definition, it once again tries to limit or actually open it up so that it addresses pipelines and conduits that are going underneath agricultural areas. And then in the third section, there is a part in there that basically says that there would be an opportunity to work with the landowner as opposed to us being completely prescriptive and saying what's going to be done. If the landowner has a different desire, then that would be changed.
Anyone want to move this substitute? Been a motion and a second. All in favor? Any opposed? The substitute's before us. Delegate Reed, you want to give us the big picture description of what your bill does?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the proposed legislation, which is, I'm referring to it as prime agricultural land protection, and the important thing here is this is about actually protecting prime agricultural land in the state of Virginia as it is defined in Virginia Code and USDA. So this is not all agricultural land, but there are very specific definitions that apply to this. And the intent here is that this would require industrial developers to utilize best practices designed to preserve the topsoil on site and ensure the topsoil is replaced on top of the completed underground pipeline or transmission line project. The intent here is, and just to give you an idea, this came out of the fact that I had gone on a visit to one of the Piedmont Environmental Council's farm and was listening to what it was that they were doing for actually protecting the topsoil in the area. And then I asked whether or not this is something that people in other parts of the state, primarily where we have a lot of agricultural going on, if they were aware of these best practices. And it is not something that's necessarily commonly known or done, and so what I did is I have worked with them and worked with Dominion and also worked with people who represent the pipelines to come up with what you have before you here today. And the intent here is that in the event that there is going to be a significant, so about a quarter-acre disturbance when a pipeline of any type, so this is not geared towards just natural gas, if there's a pipeline that's being put down and it's being affected in this area where there are these prime agricultural lands, the requirement is to work with the landowner, remove the topsoil, as it says here, to at least 12 inches of the surface soil layer, because there are some areas where it could be 3 or 4 feet deep, and then set that aside, protect it, and then once the construction is done, working with the landowner, put the topsoil back in place. What we want to avoid is we want to avoid the erosion and the loss of the topsoil. We also want to avoid having the topsoil mixed in with red clay, rocks, debris, and other things so that wherever possible we can actually maintain the quality of that prime agricultural land.
Any questions for the patron from the members of the committee? Hearing none, Delegate, do you have anyone speaking in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Catherine Bond, Dominion Energy, and thanks to the patron for working on the bill. We do support it.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. Anyone? No. Anyone here to speak against the bill? Delegate, you give the last word.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate you staying here and giving this the attention, and I would appreciate your kind consideration. So thank you.
Been a motion to report and a second. Clerk will open the roll. Members record their votes on the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. Motion report passes 9-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee members.
Thank you, Delegate Reed. Delegate Delaney?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I know we have some folks that have traveled. If we could start with HB 414, Mr. Chairman.
HB 414, sure.
All right, first I'd like to introduce the substitute.
Mr. Chairman, let's move the substitute.
There's been a motion to accept the substitute or adopt the substitute in a second. All in favor? Any opposed? Substitute's before us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee. What you have before you is a bill with amendment that changes the definition of reasonable restriction for the installation of solar panels. The original language that we have used some different figures, but the substitute before you works with let's see, a change to the restriction that is unreasonable if it adds 5% to the original cost or decreases efficiency by 10%. This amendment helps with any confusion related to the varying prices of solar installation and acknowledges that inflation and supply and demand may change the total price of solar installations over the year. So the bill before you properly defines unreasonable restrictions as they relate to homeowners being barred from installing solar panels on their homes if they live in a homeowners association. Under the proposed language, a restriction would be deemed unreasonable if it adds 5% of the original cost of installation or decreases by 10% the output and efficiency of the project. So the reason that I'm carrying this bill is the need for more reliable sources of green renewable energy. As our climate crisis becomes more dire, it's imperative that we remove restrictions on homeowners who seek to create their own sources of reliable energy. For many, it's also an issue of property rights. Currently, Virginia law allows homeowners and community associations to regulate rooftop solar systems. HOAs are able to set reasonable restrictions on their members' rights to install solar on their properties. Unfortunately, the law does not adequately define reasonable restrictions. This leads to many HOAs unfairly limiting solar installations in their community. Since 2014, HOAs have stopped more than 300 homeowners from going solar and aiding our transition away from fossil fuels, and unjustly blocking those homeowners' personal property rights to decide what happens in their homes, and have sacrificed more than $6 million in retail solar sales in Virginia. So I think there's an element of this bill that I hope would appeal to everyone, and then we do have some folks that I know are here to speak to the bill, and we've been really happy to be able to work both with our solar advocates and those representing homeowner associations to come up with this amendment, and I think have a good path forward that we can all agree on.
Thank you, Delegate Delaney. Any questions for Delegate Delaney from the committee members? Any members of the public here to speak in favor of the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Aaron Such with Solar United Neighbors. We're a nonprofit organization that represents about 10,000 prospective solar owners and solar owners in Virginia. And as the delegate mentioned, we have a problem. We have facilitated about 850 residential solar installations in Virginia since 2014. But the problem is that HOAs have blocked a tremendous amount of solar in these communities. About over 315 systems, typically with unfair site and placement that makes these systems unfeasible from a cost and performance perspective. So what the delegate is proposing really is a common sense solution that's going to give homeowners more rights, it's going to allow solar contractors to create more jobs, and it's going to set a fair balance between the right of the HOA to set reasonable authority and community standards with aesthetics, with the right of solar homeowners to take control of their energy with solar panels on their roofs. We'd urge your strong support. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Chairman, Committee. Carla Lobos, Segura Solar. We are the largest provider of rooftop solar in Virginia. We employ over 150 Virginians. Last year alone, we had 45 solar installations that were blocked by the HOAs. We are in support of creating more restrictions. We think this bill does that to a degree. We think we can further work with the patron to sort things out over time, but we would appreciate your support of this bill. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Danielle Sims with the Virginia League of Conservation Voters. We also support the bill and urge you to support as well.
Members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, my name is Chelsea Barnes. I work with Appalachian Voices. We also urge you to support the bill as our organization does. Thank you.
Corrina Bell, Sierra Club, Virginia chapter. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we support the legislation. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, Christy Smith from the Virginia Conservation Network. Our thanks to the patron, and on behalf of our 125 network partners from across the state, we urge your support. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Matt Moran, again on behalf of MDVCO, we support the bill.
Anyone here to speak against the bill? Delegate Keem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, first of all, I'm a big supporter of solar, in case anybody's wondering, and I would like to see HOAs be more cooperative, and to the extent that we can clarify state laws and allow for localities to be really able to enforce a stronger enforcement on allowing more homeowners to have solar, it would be fantastic. In fact, my wife serves on the Architectural Review Board of our HOA, and we're grappling with this exact same question right now as we speak. My question is more, I mean, I love the intent. I'm glad that you've got some supporters. My question is about how this is going to work, especially your substitute, which we're now looking at for the first time. It seems to me that one of the issues here is that you're using a new concept for what is or is not reasonable that uses the cost, the actual dollar cost of installation and or the cost, the value of the production as it's lost because of these devices, which may be an economically possible number that we can derive. But my question is, who would assess that and who would make that judgment, and how do you protect proprietary and or sensitive financial information about homeowners and their personal budgets when you're dealing with homeowners associations? Because the way I read this, a homeowner has to go to his or her homeowners association, fellow neighbors, and say, here's what I'm spending on my roof, here's what I'm spending on my bills, and you all determine for yourselves whether that's reasonable or not. And there's no government involvement, so there's no government actor sitting there asking for and or reviewing this to verify this. I'm just trying to figure out how this could be logistically done in a way that actually achieves what you want to accomplish.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question, Delegate Keem. And after I answer, I might, if any of the solar advocates would like to take a shot at their answer as well, if it varies. I'll start by saying that, you know, the origin of this bill is that currently homeowners associations can restrict solar based on an unreasonable restriction, and that just simply isn't defined. So that sets us up to a scenario where there's a tremendous amount of latitude about the very objective or subjective idea about what is a reasonable restriction and what is not. And the homeowners and their homeowners associations are arguing on this very undetermined kind of data point, right? And so by defining reasonable restriction, we brought together the stakeholders to determine what would make it a reasonable restriction on someone. And I think that for many people, the thing that makes it unreasonable is that it either costs way more than it should, or it simply doesn't work as well as it should. And you know, if there are cosmetic reasons that an architectural review board may want to deny a solar project, I think one, you know, we're seeing solar technology change so much that I'm personally hoping this is kind of a temporary need. I think that as we see solar panels become, you know, lower profile, that perhaps we'll see a paradigm shift about this. But I think when aesthetic requirements are put on a functional item like this, the main deterrent that puts, and that burden that puts on the homeowner is that it's either going to now cost them a lot more than they wanted to spend, or what the project was bidded at if it was just allowed to be optimal, or that it would decrease the efficiency of the unit by such an amount that, if I put it on that side of my roof that happens to face the shade, it's no longer worth my time to put it on there. And that the reason for those isn't really based it's not reasonable. It wouldn't be considered a reasonable restriction, because I think those are the deterrents for the homeowner. As for how they would report that, to their homeowner association, they wouldn't need to reveal necessarily the entire scope of their project. I think that if they were able to come to their the meeting and say that, this is, people could do the math and figure it out, but you're presenting the percentages, and then obviously, that could play out in different ways depending on how they wanted to make that claim. They could handle it privately at the homeowners association. I know there's a long history of homeowners needing to take legal action because of this definition of unreasonable restriction. I think we'll be cutting down on that, but that would still be an avenue for these homeowners as well. And if I don't know if anyone who's dealt with these particular scenarios, and I know we've had a lot of stakeholders come to the table to kind of come up with these definitions of what is a reasonable restriction or an unreasonable restriction, I'm happy to have them speak to that as well.
I'm looking over your shoulder at a clock that says it's 9 o'clock at night, so brevity is enjoined.
We'll be very brief. Thank you for the opportunity. Delegate Keem, to address your question, what is very typical is that an installer will give two different professionally designed certified proposals. And the strength of this is that, to the delegate's point, it does remove the opportunity for litigation, because it's very easy for them to demonstrate with a quantitative threshold about a 5% cost increase or a 10% decrease in production by those two proposals that are engineered and that are presented. Thank you.
Ms. Loeb.
Thank you. Delegate Keem, I think your question is very good and very valid. I would the original language that was proposed had a dollar figure backstop, which made it very clear and concise. The HOA association pushed back vehemently on that. We also tried to establish a timeline, a max amount of time that basically if the HOA didn't approve it under X number of days, the project could then go forward. I think either of those things are mechanisms that insulate the homeowner's privacy from the HOA association. And when I spoke earlier, I was trying to be brief, but the delegate, we've been trying to work together is the bottom line. I think we don't have a perfect solution right now. I think we'll continue to work in the coming days, but I think it's important to move this forward, to have reasonable restrictions, and then we can sort out something as this bill moves forward. Thank you.
Mr. Godfrey, did you have something to add?
Mr. Chair, just a very, very quick comment on that. I'm 100% supportive of working on some solution that provides more flexibility and more rights for homeowners and less opportunities for HOAs to block them. So don't get me wrong, I'm 100% with you on that. I'm also very, very supportive of getting more solar in Virginia. My only concern is that I don't want to pass something that sounds great. We could explain it as a bumper sticker message, but the reality is the enforcement and the mechanics of how you do it ends up not being as clear as we want it to be. I would prefer to have some kind of an objective standard rather than getting if I was a homeowner, I'd just go down to my local roofer guy and say, give me two bids. Give me an expensive one and a cheap one. And I'll go to the HOA and I'll present both of them and say, look, you're going to make me spend this much more if you do this. I can spend this much less. Therefore, under this new code section, you're violating that. So I just see too many opportunities for abuse with this, so I would prefer to have some kind of language that's like the original, and or back a few years ago when Delegate Kilgore had a bill on wireless siting, there was a language that says there's a shot clock, it's deemed authorized unless otherwise. There are all these different ways that we've done this kind of problem solving in the past. So with that, I'm very unfortunate. I'm going to put a no vote just to keep this on the regular calendar, but I have a pleasure to work with you on this because this is a very important subject.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Delegate Keem. I mean, as you saw the substitute come before you, the substitute was the result of a compromise with all the stakeholders that have an interest in this. And, we're trying to, move forward with the process that everyone feels is fair and applicable. Of course, I'm committed to working with Delegate Keem and the other stakeholders if we think that there could be some adjustments to that language. But we are presenting to you the compromise that had all of the stakeholders happy, so that's what's before you today.
Thank you, Delegate Delaney. Committee operates on motion. It's been a motion to report, properly seconded. Clerk will open the roll. Members will record their votes in the electronic voting machine. Clerk will close the roll. The bill reports with substitute 8-2. Thank you, Delegate Delaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Were you also interested in hearing HB 547?
Yes, indeed. You're next.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, there is also a substitute that we need to move. Doesn't have a substitute. All right. Stand by, Mr. Chairman. We're
language, which is line item.
adding
Co-ops, environmental electric cooperatives.
the electric cooperatives.
It's like we have
Yes.
Yeah, the Delaware Electric. Okay, because we got this directly. So this is the co-ops, and then
Oh, got lost in, okay. Okay.
Okay.
So we're just adding. And if we could pass this by temporarily, and you could take the next patron, we can sort this out and come back in a minute.
That's fine. We'll pass it by temporarily without objection. I'm going down my list here. Delegate Keem, HB 575. To save time, why don't you just present from here?
Sure, I'll make this really quick. I think I have a couple here. 575 is a bill that some of you might remember a few years ago when we passed a comprehensive bill. We created a stakeholder process that would look at, along with SEC, we created a stakeholder process that allowed for some folks to provide some feedback to our utilities on you can read the code section yourself, on a number of provisions that deal with efficiency. And this would just simply add a few more factors that they should look into in light of some of the developments that's happened recently. And there may or may not be some people who want to speak to this, but we're working with the governor's office and others to ensure that this actually is the type of information that would be more helpful for our energy efficiency purposes. So it's really a simple bill.
Thank you, Delegate. Any questions for the patron from the committee members? Anyone here to speak in favor of HB 575?
Members of the committee, I'm Lena Lewis with the Nature Conservancy, and we support this bill.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. Angela Navarro, Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Trade, and the administration supports the bill. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. Carmen Bingham of the Virginia Poverty Law Center. As a stakeholder in this group, we do support this bill.
Mr. Chairman, Christopher West, representing Conservatives for Clean Energy. We support this legislation.
Mr. Chairman, members, Walton Shepard, the NRDC. We support this legislation. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Committee, Carla Loeb, Segura Solar. We support this legislation.
Thank you, folks. Anyone here to speak against the bill? Been a motion to report, properly seconded. Clerk will open the roll. Members, please vote in the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 9-0. Delegate Keem,
Yeah, thank you.
576.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the brevity. I'll keep this one short as well. This is kind of a similar posture. Back a couple of years ago when we had that comprehensive bill, one of the provisions that was added at the request of a number of members was to require that our utilities try as best as possible to underground the transmission lines, especially in some of the suburban areas. And we, as a larger compromise, there were 2 pilot projects that were authorized in the code that said one of them should be the one in Prince William County, which has been under a lot of controversy and conversations. And so they said this would be an ideal type of pilot project that we could use to underground transmission sites. The other pilot project, we kind of left it vague to say if you all can find another project that fits this criteria, go ahead and do that as well, and the SEC will deem that to be part of the rate process. We also put a deadline of July of this year to make that happen. My understanding is that by this deadline, our utilities have not identified a second pilot that quite meets the criteria, all the criteria, although there are several candidates that may be able to meet that. One in particular, which is a very large project in Fairfax County, meets it very close to it, except for a few things. And if this bill were to go into effect by July 1, they would not be able to take advantage of this particular pilot deadline because the deadline is also July. So what this bill would do is first extend the deadline to October, and then secondly, allow for the language to be a little bit more flexible so that if a county were to come in with a project, now they would actually have county projects that would meet the criteria. Now, obviously, this doesn't guarantee that anybody gets anything, but this at least provides a situation where we would not have any pilot projects that we've authorized not be funded and not be done because we've missed the deadline and because the language that we drafted 2 years ago it doesn't quite meet any other projects that are in place. So I see this as a way to try to allow for the bill that we drafted a couple of years ago to actually go into effect as we intended. And that's really all the bill does. I think there may be some people in the audience who may want to speak to it as well if time permits.
Any questions for the delegate from the panel? Any members of the public want to speak in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chair, Catherine Bonds, Dominion Energy, and we support the legislation. Thank you, Patron.
Anyone here to speak against the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I was too slow for it. David Halleck on behalf of Tyson's Development, and we're looking at potentially using the pilot program for a project in the Tyson's area, which, as you know, heavily congested area, and the ability to underground would be extremely valuable for a number of reasons, and Fairfax County also supports this legislation.
And I'll ask again, anyone here in opposition? Delegate Keem, there's a motion to report? Second. Properly seconded. Clerk will open the roll. Members record their votes on the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 9-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for not letting me walk all the way down there and come back.
Delegate Delaney, have you worked out?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We have copies of the substitute.
Did you say there's a substitute? We're sort of drowning in paper up here. We'll find it.
Mr. Chairman, sorry about that. It looks like the drafter of the bill is not your counsel this evening, and something got a little lost in translation, but we will get caught up. So a substitute adds members from the the co-op rep and also someone from the Renewable Energy Commission to the council that we're proposing.
Do we have a motion on the substitute?
So moved.
Second. Properly moved and second. All in favor? Aye. Substitute is properly before us. Delegate Delaney, why don't you tell us what you worked out?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. So the bill before you establishes the Virginia Energy and Economy Transition Council, consisting of 30 members, to develop plans to assist the Commonwealth in transitioning from the use of fossil fuel energy to renewable energy by 2050. The bill provides that the council sunsets by July 1st of 2023. So the issue that I'm addressing here, the governor of Virginia, as well as many of those here on the committee, have made a commitment to transition the Commonwealth of Virginia away from fossil fuels by 2050, if not sooner. With the realities and impacts of climate change on our news feeds nearly every day, with our naval shipyard flooding and disappearing, and with having countless Virginians personally feel the impact of climate change, we know that we must do all that we can to transition ourselves away from the dying fossil fuel industry and into a prosperous green energy-based economy. Yet, there are regions of this Commonwealth whose economy and livelihoods are still founded in the fossil fuel industry. Currently, there are more than 4,500 coal miners, 1,100 coal plant operators, and tens of thousands of natural gas and oil production workers in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If we walk away from this economic center of these regions without providing these regions that depend on fossil fuel-based jobs and the families that rely on these jobs with alternatives for economic growth and stability, we are going to let parts of Virginia fail and cripple as we transition to a green energy-focused economy. So the solution that I'm presenting tonight is the Energy and Economy Transition Council. Outlined before you recognizes that there are several parts of Virginia that are reliant on fossil fuel industry, and that this industry supports thousands of families, while we also recognize that a reliance on the fossil fuel industry is not sustainable or good for our environment. As we transition away from fossil fuels, the Virginia Energy and Economy Transition Council will rely on economic development experts and representatives for all regions of the state, as well as the energy sector, to analyze the changes and incentives needed to transition Virginia's economy, workforce, and business community to a fossil fuel-free economy. And based on their analysis, create a transition plan for each region of the Commonwealth whose economy and workers are dependent on the fossil fuel industry today. This council is needed to ensure that no part of Virginia is left out as we become a green fossil fuel-free Commonwealth.
Thank you, Delegate Delaney. Any questions for the delegate from the members of the committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate O'Quinn.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. So I'm looking at this, the makeup of the council that you've got. You now have 30 members.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Which it is a large council, but that's your prerogative. So you've got 10 from labor, 8 from environmental, a various other smattering of folks. You've got the chairman of the 9 Go Virginia regions. So in thinking about what you talked about earlier, the areas that have been hit the hardest, the statistics you use, the employment statistics, describe Southwest Virginia the best. So I was curious if there was any consideration given to more regional specific positions in here, given that theoretically 1 out of 30 could come from our part of the state.
So, Mr. Chairman, we tried to put together a committee that would be able to best analyze the economic development future for Virginia. There were a lot of folks who came to us wanting to be added to the council, so we are at a council of 30 currently. I think my goal for this council is that the folks who are going to be affected by the energy transition plan that we see the Commonwealth moving towards are going to have a seat at the table and are going to be able to construct a plan and to report that to the General Assembly so that we can understand what we need to do to make sure that we're able to support their goals on that timeline. As far as regional membership, I think having the Go Virginia people on the council, having members of those local chambers of commerce on the council, having those energy employers who are transitioning out of that area to be able to provide updates on that transition was our intent for the makeup as it exists right now on this. We want to have a comprehensive gathering of people who are best able to answer the question of, as we transition away from this current industry in Virginia, what is the plan? And I think it shouldn't be a decision that legislators from my district should be making about where those economies' futures lie. I think it's important that the folks who live in those districts, who represent the businesses in those districts, who are the economic development authorities in those districts, are the ones that are guiding the future of the Commonwealth that we are all making an impact on by many of the decisions that we're making this legislative year and beyond, moving towards clean energy.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate O'Quinn.
Mr. Chairman, I understand where you're coming from, and you still didn't answer my question. So what assurances are in this bill that there will be more than 1 out of 30? I understand that the governor could potentially appoint 15 people from Southwest Virginia. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not saying there should be that many. Given that it's our part of the state that has been and continues to be hit hardest by this, this feels an awful lot like Richmond knows best, and that doesn't set real well. So I would like to know what's in the bill or what can go in the bill that guarantees that we're not going to be told what's best for us because, as you might understand, it's frustrating at best.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would say to Delegate O'Quinn that your concerns are what I'm trying to address. What has prompted me to carry this legislation is what I've seen is an aggressive move that I support the science of climate change. I support the aggressive move that we're taking to move away from fossil fuel, but I have not heard anything about as we advocate for this aggressive change, are we going to answer what happens to the economies that we are impacting the most with that change? So my intent with this was to have members of those chambers of commerce. I would be happy to name locations or regions. If I know it has the Virginia Chamber of Commerce. My vision for this would be that those Chamber of Commerce representatives would be from those regions. That those Go Virginia, that would include the representative for those regions. That was part of the reason why we created the scope of this council, was to ensure that it wasn't going to be us legislating what happens next. Because we're legislating currently, and there's policy provisions that are currently affecting these regions, your region's economy. And I haven't yet heard, as we're advocating for this green energy future, what the economic development transition plan is for the regions that are going to be most impacted. So my intent is to have those local leaders be the ones that have the seat at the table and have a say and advise us, what do you need to create the economy that will work for that region. So that's the intent.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate O'Quinn.
Delegate Laney, I would agree with you entirely on that because we have been the ones trying to sound the alarm for the last 10 years that we're talking about making this massive transition with no plan whatsoever to backfill the thousands and thousands of jobs that we have lost and are going to continue to lose. And a wink and a nod or a promise is something that's very difficult for people to stomach and very difficult for us to try to build a future on. So I understand where you're coming from, frustrated with the approach.
Delegate Delaney, I have a question I'm a little afraid to ask. I can't find an impact statement. Is there money in the budget for this? Or?
We've submitted a budget amendment.
There is a budget amendment.
There is a budget amendment.
Any other questions for the patron? Anyone in the audience here to speak in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Chelsea Barnes. I work for Appalachian Voices. I live in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, and Wise County. I work in our new economy program, working exactly on these kinds of plans mentioned. to transition the economy. We're working directly in these communities that are on the front lines that Delegate Quinn spoke to, trying to transition. As he mentioned, we could have used this plan about 10 years ago, but we're in support of the bill, and because we know that other communities will need this. In addition to Southwest Virginia, we aren't the only community that's going to be impacted by these job changes, and know that other communities will need this as well. So we support the goals. The message that I'm bringing to you from Wise County, from Southwest Virginia, is that our communities are hurting from this transition. We keep talking about clean energy plans. We keep talking about 100% clean energy, but no one is talking about how to make sure that Southwest Virginia is included in those plans. I find myself shouting it every day. So we are, our region has a higher unemployment rate. We have a higher poverty rate than the rest of the state. We're in an opioid crisis. And we are surrounded by more than 100,000 acres of abandoned mine land sites that still need to be cleaned up. I drive by regularly high wall sites that have boulders and rocks falling from them that have yet to be stabilized from the coal mining companies that left. Our communities really, again, needed this plan a decade ago, but we, support the idea. We'd love to see more assurances that the communities will be involved in the process and heard in the process, but appreciate the effort and look forward to working with the council. We urge you to support this bill. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I'm Sam Brumberg, counsel to Virginia's electric cooperatives. With gratitude to the patron, we rise in support of the bill, Virginia's clean energy economy, and our rural members. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, Danielle Sims with the Virginia League of Conservation Voters. We also encourage you to support the bill.
Anybody here to oppose the bill? It's been a motion to report, properly seconded. Clerk will open the roll. Members, please record your votes on the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports with a substitute, 6-4.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Delegate Rome.
It's good to see you again, Mr. Chairman, and to the members of the committee. I have a substitute that's being passed around right now.
Delegate Rome, while we're getting the substitute, can you explain to us what it does?
Sure. Thank you so kindly, Mr. Chairman, to the members of the committee. So the substitute for HB 1030 would prohibit above-ground transmission lines along the I-66 corridor between Gainesville and Haymarket in the area where the hybrid route will be placed. That was based off of the 2018 legislation. I am happy to report that we have worked nonstop over the last year to get to Peace in the Valley with Dominion on this, along with my local stakeholders from the town of Haymarket, from the Coalition to Protect Prince William County. And I believe if everything is still cool as of right now, we're still neutral. Our domain's still neutral on this. We're good. And basically what this does is, after the giant fights that we had about above-ground transmission lines in this corridor in 2006, and again with the most recent bout that started in 2014, this basically, the substitute here will give us 10 years where we know we're not going to have another fight like this in this corridor, where what we're talking about at this point is that if they would like to do undergrounding there, where a current undergrounding transmission project is going based on the hybrid route, that's fine. If you want to deal with electrical distribution lines, which are inherently different from 69 kV or higher transmission lines, that's fine. You were just talking about the stuff that power your home, power your small business. What this legislation will basically do is it is going to preclude the ability of the Prince William Board of County Supervisors from putting another data center in the woods in Haymarket where it doesn't belong, or in some other place where they're not supposed to be doing this because it's supposed to go in Innovation Park. And so the thing is, by statute, Dominion has to power, bulk load customers that are put into an area like this. And so what we're trying to basically do here is say, look, the people of Western Prince William County have spoken out on this time and time and time again. They do not want 110-foot high power towers going along this area. And we have gotten to a point where None of us want to have to keep having this fight anymore. We're good. And so, Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Is there a motion on the substitute?
Move the substitute.
Properly moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. It's properly before us. Delegate, can I just ask you?
Sure.
You've told us what it does. How's it different from its original introduction?
Yeah, sure.
as you
So the
originally
first thing
introduced
that it does is it has a 10-year sunset clause on it, so that basically from enactment of this bill, which would basically be July 1st, that'll go for 10 years. The original bill did not have a sunset clause. The second change on this is that I changed the words from area or I think it was the original legislation I'm pulling up here. It had it as in the same area or corridor. We replaced that language with a more narrowly defined right-of-way. So this basically, we know exactly which part of Western Prince William we're talking about here. And we basically said that on the bottom of this is for a period of 10 years from the effective date of this act, but shall not preclude placement of any underground transmission lines in such right-of-way or any electrical distribution lines in such right-of-way.
Delia, one other question.
Sure.
You were
Thank you, Mr.
originally
Chairman.
writing this to the pilot program.
Correct.
Section. This no longer has anything to do with the pilot program.
That's correct. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, because the pilot program is entirely about this corridor, what we're basically doing here is we're amending that section of code to say, look, the hybrid program can go on as the legislature passed it. This just makes sure that as that's going in, that we're not going to have above ground power lines, power transmission lines going through that particular corridor at any other given point during the next 10 years. This way we have a chance to completely reevaluate in Prince William what our economic development priorities are supposed to be, especially toward the rural crescent, especially in this part of the part of the county that was never designed to have bulk load customers in the first place.
Delegate Kilgore?
Yeah, I would just like to ask, who is going to, will this cost be spread over, if they go underline, will it be spread over everybody in Dominion's territory?
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, while I think that the folks at Dominion would be best equipped to answer that question, I'll actually just defer to them to make sure that we get the information accurate.
So I was about to ask for anyone testifying in support of the bill. Is that why you're here, Ms. Bond?
Mr. Chairman, Catherine Bond, Dominion, we are supportive of the bill with the narrowed scope. And as a reminder, this goes in a specific right-of-way where we're already putting transmission lines underground. But to answer Delegate Kilgore's question, yes, those costs would be socialized to other customers.
Any other questions for the patron from the members of the committee? Anyone else here to testify in favor of the bill? Anyone here to testify against the bill? Delegate Lopez.
Move to report.
Wait a minute. If you could, would you mind withdrawing that for a second? Delegate Kilgore? Oh. I'm trying to work my request to speak button here. Delegate Lopez, you have something to say?
Yes, move to report, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone want to second that?
It's been properly moved and seconded. Clerk will open the roll. Members will please vote on the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports with a substitute by a vote of 6-4. Thank you, Delegate Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the members of the committee, and thank you to everyone who worked with me on this.
Let's move on to HB 167. Delegate Ware.
Mr. Chairman, members of this subcommittee, this is a familiar bill to all of you. It's one that passed this subcommittee, the full committee, and the House last year. Didn't fare quite as well in the other body. What it would do is the bottom line for me is it ensures that the ratepayers only pay for what they need in terms of the fuel factor that supplies electric power through much of the Commonwealth. It's a familiar bill, but it's not exactly the same bill. Let me make a couple of points about this. Natural gas power plants make up about a quarter of the generation fleet for Dominion. Costs for pipeline contracts are a much larger portion of fuel costs, obviously, than they used to be. To give you one example, I've been given a 1 year in 2018, Dominion asked to recover about $1.5 billion in total fuel costs from its customers, up from $221 in its 2017 request. These are done through the fuel factor, which they recover from customers, ratepayers. HB 167 is intended primarily, as I said, to protect the ratepayers. It doesn't change when the SCC reviews delivery contracts. It does not retroactively change SCC review of contracts already delivering gas to Dominion's plants. In fact, it expressly does not apply retroactively to those contracts. It applies only to contracts above and beyond the existing portfolio of contracts. I mentioned earlier that this is a familiar bill, but it's not the same bill. I've been in conversation with folks from Dominion. I've made a couple of changes specifically to answer some of the concerns that they have raised. We mentioned the two principal ones. The first I've mentioned that it is no longer a retroactive review. The SCC will evaluate the utility's needs and alternative options at the time the utility seeks cost recovery. Secondly, in relation to a request that came in very recently, in the substitute, and I probably should have asked for the substitute to be passed out. It does have several changes. This is the most noteworthy one.
Substitute, Delegate Ware. Probably moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Substitutes before us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It does incorporate their recommendation that it only apply to contracts for longer than 10 years and more than 250,000 decatherms, and you will have to ask them what that means, per day, as opposed to any contract, regardless of duration or size. And I do pledge to this committee that as we go forward, I will continue to be in conversation with them, as I have been. I like to think, since they've kind of been on a roll in supporting bills till now, that they might kind of have come around and they may come up behind me and say they support it, but I'm not holding my breath on that. Let me say one other thing that has come up, and that is that this bill does not target the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. If it did, I would not be standing here. HB 167 doesn't give SCC oversight of ACP construction or operation. It doesn't prevent Dominion from using its reserved pipeline ACP capacity once it is operational. It doesn't give or doesn't prevent Dominion from charging its customers for the ACP delivery contract. What it says is there has to be a demonstration of the need for this particular facility for customers in Virginia. That, in short, is what the bill provides. There are a couple people who would like to speak briefly to it.
Thank you, Delegate Ware. Let me just first ask, any questions from the members of the committee? Hearing none, that's great. Thank you, members of the committee. Anyone here to speak in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I'm Will Cleveland with the Southern Environmental Law Center. Just want to say thank you to the patron for bringing this bill for you, and we support the bill.
Mr. Chairman, Carmen Bingham again with the Virginia Poverty Law Center. We are in support of this bill.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Meade Browder with the Attorney General's Office. I think as most of you all know, in our Consumer Counsel role, we appear in the rate cases at the SCC, including these fuel factor cases that this would be the subject of. We supported the bill last year, and we support the bill this year as well. Thank you.
Anyone here to speak against the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members.
Delegate Rust, how are you?
I'm John Rust. I'm here on behalf of Dominion. I do want to say, first of all, thank you to Delegate Ware. He has been very active in talking to us to try to address some of the issues that are here. I think you see some of that that's in the substitute. Unfortunately, I don't think we've addressed everything that we need to address, and that's the reason we're here to oppose the bill. Let me ask you if you would look for a second at the substitute. and look at subsection 2 that begins on line 71. That is the existing code section which addresses how the State Corporation Commission looks at these fuel factors and addresses them. And it says that they've got to show that you've made every reasonable effort to minimize costs, that you don't have unreasonable costs, given in regard to the reliability of the service and the reliable sources of supply. Those are very good criteria for reviewing your fuel costs that you go through every time. What this bill does is it says when you've got your first consideration of a fuel contract, you've got to look at it differently. And the concern that we have is the changes in how you have to look at it would effectively ban recovery from any of the pipelines that are in the process. When we first started talking to Delegate Ware about this, we said we've got to change the criteria because every fuel factor application that we have has about 100 contracts for different types of fuel and different amounts that we do on a regular basis. And the insertion of the 250 decatherms and the 150,000 decatherms on the 10-year term was intended basically to say, look, we're only going to look at the major contracts if we're going to look at them under this bill at all. Second thing is, if you will look at the 4 criteria that are there, the first criteria basically says that you don't have or you have an additional need for the contract that you've entered into. That negates the ability to use that contract to replace existing fuel sources. So if we want to put the coal aside and use the gas, we can't do that under this bill. It also says that we have to investigate all alternative sources of supply, not just a reasonable investigation of what the alternative sources of supply may be. Our concern is that if this bill passes in the way it does, you effectively are going to negate the ability to recover costs from any of the pipelines, and particularly the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I think that will destroy the economy in Tidewater, Virginia, and put us in a very difficult posture. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Delegate Rust, I thought you were going to tell us what a decatherm was.
It's an amount of energy that we buy. I don't know precisely what it is, but this is one which would give us the opportunity to keep the smaller contracts, which are generally very small, very piecemeal contracts, out of the review.
Delegate Kilgore.
1 million BTUs each. Okay.
I just have a question to Delegate Rust. Delegate Ware said that it just didn't apply to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, but I'm hearing you say something different.
Well, we're looking at it from the purview of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and this would effectively block that. It would also block other pipelines and other fuel sources where the utility is coming in to actually make a request to recover fuel. So any of the situations in the West, where you've got Appalachian Power, you'd have the same situation.
What about the Mountain Valley Pipeline?
I think the Mountain Valley Pipeline, to the extent it's a utility recovery, would have a problem. Remember, this is a review of a utility fuel cost done by the Commission.
Any other questions from members of the panel?
Thank you, sir.
Any other members of the public to testify against the bill? Delegate Ware, you have the last word. Oh, no, is that all your witnesses?
That is, although I did want to respond, both myself and have
Please.
An expert to Delegate Kilgore's question. I would note that, as I understand it, both in 2018 and in 2019, the State Corporation Commission ruled that Dominion's existing portfolio of pipeline delivery contracts is sufficient for the size of its fleet. There is nothing else in the pipeline right now. Wrong phraseology. There are no other plants as I understand it, that would be taking up more natural gas.
Well, we have one more comment. Ms. Cleveland, you're up.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Again, Will Cleveland from the Southern Environmental Law Center. I thank the patron. And Delegate Ware is correct. And for the last several years, we've been litigating these fuel dockets at the State Corporation Commission. And I want to distinguish between two different types of natural gas power plants. You have combined cycle gas power plants, which are the massive base load power plants like the Greensville generating facility that Dominion built a few years ago. Those run pretty much 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For those types of facilities that are running all the time, the utilities prudently sign long-term fuel delivery contracts. That makes sense, and I'm not disputing that that's how you deliver gas to those plants. Separately, you have smaller, what's called combustion turbine gas plants, or peaker plants. Those don't run 24/7. Those run very rarely, only when the electric load is at its peak. That's why they're called peakers. For those contracts, nobody signs year-round, multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar delivery contracts because it isn't prudent to do so. You buy delivery on the spot market. Delegate Ware said that there are no new gas plants coming. At least that's true according to Dominion's own IRPs. They are not building any new baseload power plants, according to their planning documents. Whether they build a combustion turbine, a peaker plant, is a separate question. And this bill doesn't affect that because it doesn't apply to a contract for less than 10 years. Delegate Ware is also right that the Commission has found over the last 2 years that the existing pipeline delivery portfolio is adequate for the size of the baseload power plant fleet that they have, which isn't growing. I know members of the Commission staff are here if the panel has more questions, but thank you very much.
Delegate Kilgore?
Could I ask somebody from the Commission staff then a question? Whoever.
You can do rock, paper, scissors or something.
Yes, depends on the questions.
Depends on the question. Yes, sir. Kim Paper with the Commission. I can answer accounting questions. If not, I might have to phone a friend.
Well, my question is, do you, in listening to Delegate Rust and now Delegate Ware, do you already have the authority to do this?
The Commission has a process.
I'm just asking.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a hearing that the Commission holds that gathers evidence concerning the fuel costs for the projected coming year and looking at the costs that were incurred previously. So any evidence that's presented to the Commission is taken under consideration, and the Commission makes its decision based on that evidence. So if somebody brings up these questions or these issues, then it's addressed by the Commission.
Yes or no? Or?
Yes, as long as the issues are brought before the Commission for consideration.
Okay, I'd like to hear.
My layman's response to that is true. They exist. That's the underlying, what you see beside it. What I'm adding specifically makes very clear the question that I've always wanted to answer. Is this necessary for the ratepayers and therefore a legitimate thing for the ratepayers to be recovered from, or is this entrepreneurial on Dominion's part? And that's the distinction I want to make, and that's why the bill is before you.
Delegate Rust, you look like you want to say something.
Just one thing, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman. If, in fact, we complete the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and if, in fact, we want to purchase fuel from the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, we cannot do so if this bill passes. And that means that if that's the lower cost of the facilities that we can buy, and we want to use it, we couldn't do so the way this bill is set up. We will be purchasing a portion of the gas from the Atlantic Coast Pipeline as a lower cost, more reliable alternative, and we could not do that under the terms of this bill.
Delegate Kilgore?
Jack, could you point to where that is, what you just said in the bill?
If you'll look, Delegate Kilgore, Mr. Chairman, at number 1, it says we can't meet the service obligation without additional fuel. If we want to use the fuel coming in that pipeline to meet our service obligation and to offset contracts that we have at a higher cost, we can't do that.
Delegate Heretic?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure the question is for either Delegate Rust or Delegate Ware. Included in my district is the Norfolk Navy base. 5 carrier task forces, about 60,000 uniformed service members. That is the single largest fuel or energy user in Hampton Roads. There have been routine interruptions in service over the past several years to the point where, well, I mean, I don't want to overly dramatize this, but they have been of concern to the Defense Department. My concern with respect to this bill is to whether, given the fact that the supply has been up to now inadequate, whether this bill would frustrate the ability of the Navy to continue to compete for enhanced fuel delivery.
I'll let Delegate Ware answer as well, but from our perspective, we intend that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is going to serve that need of the Navy. There would be a provision coming directly from the pipeline to the Navy if, because of this bill, we can't build or fund the pipeline, we can't serve the Navy.
Delegate Keane? Delegate Ware, did you want to respond in some way?
One thing I'd like to note is the very last sentence in this section that I propose to add. And it says, nothing in this subdivision shall limit the Commission's discretion to review and make a determination as to the reasonableness of the recovery by a utility of costs, including those incurred under a natural gas capacity contract that were previously subject to a review under this subdivision. We're explicitly making it clear that this can be reviewed, and if the SCC determines that it's can be done and should be done, they are free to do so.
Delegate Keane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't planning on speaking about this issue because I support the bill. I supported it last year, and I'm planning on supporting it again. And I took the gentleman's word, Delegate Ware's word, that this does not impact the two current pipeline projects that are pending in Virginia, whatever its future may be. And I understand former Delegate Rust's interpretation that the way he explained it, it could potentially have that impact. Now, I see that, and I understand that part. The part that concerns me, though, is that in the event that ACP or MVP are built, and in the event that ACP, the companies behind it, would like to use that as the excuse for why they cannot build that, I wonder if all the costs that have already been sunk into those projects, who would be responsible for that? Would Dominion and or MVP EQT absorb that now, or would they be coming to the SCC and seek recovery in other proceedings because this bill, this act would then require, or in their interpretation, would result in them not being able to build ACP. There are costs already sunk. Who would be responsible for that? Because there's already costs out there that the ratepayers are going to be responsible for regardless of what happens to the ultimate outcome of those projects. So comparing that cost that the ratepayer may be having to absorb versus whatever potential hypothetical costs in this bill seems to me pales in the comparison.
Can I reg somebody?
You're phoning a friend?
Phoning a friend.
That's
yes.
fine.
I don't know who the right person to ask that.
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond to Delegate Keane's question, and I'm sure Delegate Rust will correct me if I get any of this wrong. Dominion is a holding company that wholly owns a subsidiary, which is the regulated utility that comes before the State Corporation Commission. That wholly owned subsidiary regulated utility is not building the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. An entirely separate affiliate of the holding company is building the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Currently, all of the costs of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline lie on that unregulated affiliate. The only time that any of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline costs will fall upon a Dominion Electric customer is through this fuel proceeding. That's the only time. If they don't come through this fuel proceeding, then all those costs are collected through all of the other customers the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has, which are predominantly also subsidiaries of the developers. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline is being built by Duke, Dominion, and the Southern Company. 90% or more of the entire pipeline's capacity is already reserved by subsidiaries of those three companies, and the bulk of that is for electric generation, not for delivery to the Navy or to anybody else. So if the pipeline does not get built, those costs will not fall upon the Dominion Electric customers, absent some change in the law that I have not seen coming. I hope that answers the delegate's question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brower, you look like you wanted to weigh in.
Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Cleveland covered. I was just kind of getting in position, but I think maybe an analogy, Delegate Keane, correct. This project is being built by affiliates of VEPCO. VEPCO, Virginia Electric Power Company, is the legal entity that's the public utility regulated by the State Corporation Commission. A distinction might be if the commission found a power plant that VEPCO is constructing, if they found it prudent and approved construction of it, and along the course of construction, there were cost overruns or problems or whatever, and a decision was made to scrap the project, then that might be a situation where ratepayers could be on the hook if the commission had found, it kind of blessed it up front, proceed. You'd have to have probably a proceeding at the commission to kind of weigh the equities of who's going to bear the brunt of those costs. But this is a separate affiliate. The costs have not been before the commission. The commission has not in any way, commission, correct me if I've got this wrong, but I'm confident I don't. The commission has not in any way given any kind of approvals for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the entities that are constructing it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that explanation. And that satisfies my curiosity. And the bottom line to me, and the way you've interpreted that, it means that there are no costs associated with ACP today that any Dominion ratepayer is paying right now. So whether the project goes forward or not does not impact ratepayers today. If this bill were to go into effect, and hypothetically if those concerns come up, that would be at the discretion of the SEC. So I don't think this bill does any harm to what we're talking about. And as a result, I think what Delegate Ware said about the no impact on ACP is actually accurate.
All right.
One brief response.
Delegate Rust.
Mr. Cleveland and Mr. Browder are correct in terms of their description of how this is being built. What is interesting, though, is because the pipeline has not been completed, there's been no cost of fuel that's been presented to the SCC, and we will not have an opportunity to recover that cost until it's approved by the SCC. What Delegate Ware was pointing to in terms of the ability to do things that have already been approved doesn't apply, and the money coming from the Atlantic Coast Pipeline has to be approved as a part of a fuel factor operation.
Thank you, Delegate Rust. All right. Any other questions from the panel? Committee acts on motion. Been a motion to report, properly seconded. Clerk will open the roll. Members record their votes on the electronic voting system. Clerk will close the roll. The bill reports with a substitute 5-3. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, some good news here. Delegate Heretic has asked that we take HB 656 and 657 by for the day. That's 656 and 657. I need a motion on that. Properly moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. 656 and 657 are by for the day. So, batting cleanup. Delegate O'Quinn, HB 1280. I don't care. Save the time. Do it from there.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have House Bill 1280 that, and there is a substitute to this, but it's a very short substitute.
Can I get a motion? All in favor of the substitute?
Aye.
Say aye. The substitute's properly before us. Why don't you tell us what the substitute does, Delegate O'Quinn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This expands slightly on the broadband pilot bill that I had last year. So essentially, the utilities are required to run fiber to connect their substations and use that excess fiber to provide broadband service in rural communities by leasing a portion of that to an internet service provider. So what this bill will essentially allow is to be able to utilize that excess broadband capacity to offset any costs that might be incurred by the ratepayer.
Any questions from the panel to Delegate O'Quinn? Is there anyone in the audience here to testify in favor of HB 1280? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Amanda Cox with Appalachian Power. We support the bill, and we actually have our very first broadband pilot before the commission tomorrow morning. So we appreciate the delegate giving us more opportunities to use our middle mile for connectivity.
Question.
Ma'am, question for you? Delegate Marshall.
Yes, could you tell us the location of that project?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Marshall, it will be Grayson County, Virginia. That's the first pilot.
Is that Southwest?
It is Southwest.
Is there anyone in the audience here to testify against HB 1280? I sense momentum here. Move to report. Second. Motion is properly made and seconded. Clerk will please open the roll. Members, please vote on the electronic voting system. The bill reports with a substitute 8-0. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned. Thank you for your patience.